It's New Year's Day today, and I'm taking the dogs out. It's really cold again. But I've just been reading through some bits of stuff on the net, and I thought it'd be quite useful for myself to kind of review some of the key ideas which seem to underpin a lot of my thinking in these videos and in the bits of writing that I do alongside these. And I came across this quote by Mark Johnson again that I've used a couple of times in the past, which I think is really well, it's very succinct, and it sort of sums up a lot of the ideas that I'm thinking about in ways that are much more elegant than I could do it. And he says something like meaning and thought. He's talking about, I think it's in The Meaning of the Body, it's the book he wrote. He says meaning and thought emerge from our capacity for perception, object manipulation, and bodily movement. So he's basically saying that the thoughts and the meanings that we attribute, the meanings that those thoughts kind of pertain to, are mapped across from physical embodied experiences. He's particularly, as I say, talking about just perception, and he means perception in all its forms, not just visual perception, but perceptions of the senses, objects and their manipulation, and bodily movement. And these are the capacities that meaning and thought emerge from. And in various videos and other bits of things, I think I've picked up on different aspects of that idea. So let me just see if I can go through this in my mind. Perception, certainly, I talk about it in terms of sense, but when he says that meaning and thought emerge from perception, I think what he means there, or my interpretation of that, is to do with how we treat objects of knowledge and instantiations of meaning as if they were impacts that we have on our bodily senses. And these instantiations of knowledge and meaning vary in an orderly way according to the variation in those different sensory modes. So as I said before, when we think and talk about knowledge that we can kind of see, we talk about it as if it was a visual object, sort of separate from the body, distant, brightly lit, clearly bounded, all those kind of things, in the way that visual objects are. And when we talk about feelings or felt responses, we're drawing on a tactile perception, or maybe a proprioceptive perception, with all the different entailments that come with that sensory mode, to do with proximity, contact, force against the body, perhaps interiority, maybe darkness, or at least the absence of light. It's a whole different set of entailments which figure around that one. And similarly with hearing and smell and taste. I think taste is a particularly interesting one. But so when he's talking about perception, how I'm reading that is as a set of tools for constructing meaning and knowledge and thought based on or built from the structures of sensory engagement. The next bit is to do with, in that quotation he says, object manipulation, which is both objects, which I've talked about. Objects have very particular kind of properties, and they vary in very particular ways. For example, objects have a different sort of substantial quality. Objects can be hard, or they can be soft, or they can be fluid, or they can be gaseous even. And that engagement that we have for objects, and the different kinds of manipulation that are possible with different kinds of objects, again maps across onto our understandings of meaning. So, for example, And my dogs have just seen another dog, I just let him go ahead. He's a nice one, there's no fighting going on there. So in terms of objects and their manipulation, again we talk about meanings and think about meanings, particularly something like knowledge, in terms of, for example, its hardness or its softness. We talk about hard facts. We talk about more sort of fluid ways of knowing. We might even talk about ethereal or vaporous kinds of knowledge, when it's something that we find hard to grasp or hard to get a handle on, or something that slips through our fingers, those kind of things. So we're attributing meaning by using our experiences of object manipulation, again, to quote from Mark Johnson. And then bodily movement is the third thing he cites as a source of thought and meaning. And I've spoken before about walking as an aspect of that, but it's also to do, I think, with the kind of affordances that the world offers to us, and how things like reaching, grasping, stepping over, standing, lying, these different things that the body can do, changes relationships between oneself and the objects of knowledge, and the kind of attributions of meaning one would give to those objects. So I think that's where he's going with that, or at least that's where I'm going with him with that. The bit that he doesn't draw close attention to, I think, in that quotation, I'll just remind myself what it was. Meaning and thought emerge from our capacity for perception, object manipulation and bodily movement. What he doesn't draw attention to, in which, and I may be misquoting him dramatically here, is this term capacity that he uses, which I think is a really interesting term. Because of course, even whilst he's talking about metaphor, and whilst he's talking about concepts, and whilst he's talking about meaning, the language that he's using inevitably and circuitously and self-referentially is also threaded through with metaphors and poetic allusions. And this word capacity that he uses in there is part of that, in my opinion. So he's talking about these properties, these perceptions, objects, movements, as emerging within a capacity. And capacity is kind of volumetric, it's spatial. So I think implicit within that, and kind of covert within that quotation, is this spatialization, or this hypothetical space in which these meaning attributions and knowledge gathering processes can take place. And again, I've spoken about that before, but not perhaps in the context of that quotation. But there is a kind of capacity that one inevitably occupies in order to attribute meaning. And by capacity I mean this space that I'm in right now, for example, a space which has horizontal extension, both in terms of proximity and distance, but also the extension that ultimately forms the horizon, that kind of horizontal extension, left to right, right to left, but also has vertical extension, top to bottom, and all sorts of again, all sorts of entailments emerge out of those variables and those structures. I think the last thing about capacity that's quite interesting in that is that it's a term that the 18th century mystic Thomas Traherne used. Come on, Pops, come on, off you go.